Well, good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Alexandre. We're here on Cure America. Normally you'd see Donald Eason here, the president of Cure, but he's actually in Israel, and you'll be able to get an update from him. It's an incredible time in our nation. It's an incredible time around the world, and we have a panel of experts. We're just going to dive right into what's going on here on Capitol Hill, what's going on around the world. If the Capitol Hill is sort of like a rock concert, then consider this a behind-the-scenes look. You get to go backstage and really pick apart what's going on. Sort of like a music festival where we have the bands coming together. And first we'll have Marty Dannenfelser, and you know him well. He's the Vice President of Government Relations and Coalitions here at Cure. Marty, thanks so much for always being here and joining us on the show.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And we have Kris Ullman. You know Kris very well. She's the president of Eagle Forum. I always say this about Kris. This is sort of the time and season in which Eagle Forum was birthed for.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you so much, Kris, for joining us. And then familiar face to you all, we've had him a couple of years back, is Paul Teller. He's the Executive Vice President of Advancing American Freedom. And Paul was gracious to us to join us this week. You've joined us in the past, but it's great to have you, Paul. And we'll lean a bit on you. We'll talk across the board on all of our organizational updates, but coming out of Advancing American Freedom, just sort of give us, the 30-second overview of how y'all were founded, but also give us sort of a picture of what you're expecting to do in the next 3 months or so. So just walk us through Advancing American Freedom,
your
founding, and where you are now.
Great honor to be here. Always good to see you. Great people, great friends. So Advancing American Freedom, the issue advocacy organization founded by former Vice President Mike Pence right after the White House, basically with the goal of staying in the game, of still, as the name implies, advancing freedom every day, especially with Biden and Harris in office at that moment. Freedom was receding every day.
That's right.
And so he said, we got to have an organization, have a beachhead to promote freedom every day. And we've, grown, not tremendously, but I would say steadily, about 15 or so staffers now, give or take.
That's a solid
just enough to, just enough to, cause some trouble around Washington, around the political world. And we're just trying to advance a, full spectrum, traditional conservative agenda in Washington, out of Washington, around the states, around the conservative movement every day. A few priorities, I would say, over the next few months reflect what we've been doing also in the past. Tax reform, big thing for us, not just extending the Trump-Pence tax cuts, but growing them, providing additional tax relief for American businesses, American individuals, et cetera, working on some of the tariffs that have been happening. We like some and not others. I'm sure we'll dive into that, but you can imagine that's the case. But also a lot, and I'm sure friends here in the panel feel the same way. The reconciliation bill, that's the fancy Washington word for getting a spending cut bill and a tax reform bill through Congress in an accelerated way, and so just kind of helping with that and making sure that we're actually cutting government.
Yeah, excellent. One thing that you mentioned right there at the start is a traditional conservatism. There is a lot of publicity. There's a lot in terms of a mandate that can really be pushed forward at full steam. But we want to maintain that traditional conservatism, which means we're preserving what's in the past, but also not putting anything into law or through sort of rogue bills that are coming to the floor that we'll regret later on. The Democrats probably do that when they're in power most often, either cut the requirements for votes on judges or a number of other things that long-term affects them and really dilutes the separation of powers. And so your approach to traditional conservatism is that forward sort of 50, 60 year down the road look and just maintaining that whatever we put into place now are really good conservative principles.
Absolutely. And constitutional conservatism, strong American leadership, traditional American social values, and obviously, more of a free market, approach to economics. Putting that all together and pushing on it every day.
Well, certainly. Well, thank you, Paul. We're going to dive into a lot of what he said here in a moment, but I also want to turn to you, Kris, and give us an organizational sort of overview or update. I know Eagle Forum has, a center place, not just at the Speaker's office, but also at the White House, influence all across the country. And so your name has popped up in so many different circles, and we're encouraged by that. But tell us really what are the updates? What's sort of the next 3-month perspective at Eagle Forum?
Well, Eagle Forum was started by Phyllis Schlafly in 1972 to address the pro-life and pro-family issues. And I was so delighted last week to be able to attend the White House. President Trump had a celebration of Women's History Month. And it was fantastic to be there. And he talked about a lot of the issues that we work on every day. Okay. Number one, there are two sexes, male and female. And guess what? They're different.
That's crazy.
It's crazy.
Wait a minute.
And they're both great, but they are different. So he talked about that and his executive order on that. And we are just pleased that that a bill has been introduced in both the House and Senate to define sex as male and female, and so we've endorsed that. We also are fighting against the really indoctrination of our children into this gender ideology. So that was another thing that President Trump talked about. And then the Speaker of the House was there, and a bunch of Republican members of Congress just talking about what women's issues are. And guess what? Women's issues are family issues, are men's issues as well.
Right. Yep.
Taxes, education, making America healthy again. Moms care so much about the health of their children. So that's another thing. And our state leaders have been very busy in the states as their legislatures are in session. In Utah, we were able to ban flavored vapes for kids.
So important, yeah.
We were able to make sure that ideological flags like the trans flag is not flown in schoolrooms. In Alabama, we've been working hard on preventing gambling and other things that hurt families. And our Pennsylvania chapter, we're just establishing a new Pennsylvania chapter. I was able to go up there.
Very important state.
Yeah, last week and find out that the new governor of Pennsylvania wants to make money by legalizing recreational marijuana. So that's another thing we're going to be fighting up there and across the country.
It's terrible. That last bit there, it's terrible in states that have done it. Florida in this past election cycle said no to it. And can you imagine like a Daytona Beach or Miami Beach flooded with marijuana smoke? We're sort of here in the bubble, in DC bubble, we get that. In Maryland, the state that we drive in from, like, not just the pungent smell, but the deleterious effects that it does to the brain cells, the developing brain cells of these adolescent youth. I'm glad that you guys are fighting against the flavored vape. And you think of how much of a big tent the Republican Party is able to draw in when we do talk about these health issues.
Right.
You know, flavored vape that's at kids' eye leveled in different candy flavors that are attracting youth to participate in smoking, all sorts of substances. I think that's a strong push.
And the edibles for marijuana, and little Skittles type things. So these are issues, and if you take the macro picture, why do we want our government to make money off of destroying our children's brains and lives? It's really immoral.
Some of those vice things. I want to sit on you just a little bit because you mentioned so much gambling.
Yes.
This new perspective of having instantaneous gambling on your phone. There's a direct correlation to suicide as mainly young men between the ages of 18. And in some states, they're too young to be gambling. Like there's a federal limit. There's in certain states 21 years old to gamble. But they have access to these online gambling sites. They're gambling and developing suicidal ideation when they're losing hard-earned money because it's like a game. It's something that they can't tangibly feel or tangibly understand the amount of resources that they're pouring into this. And so you have suicidal ideation developing in these young men as a result of gambling. And I like your approach in not shying away from that.
Yes.
And I think really the last thing you mentioned that is so important is the curriculum. So what's occurring at the school board levels, but also at the state levels in terms of the LGBT agenda that was on a full course and really in the minds of the next generation as they're polluting schools and polluting curriculums. The fact that you all are fighting there at the school board level and in state curriculums, that's such an important work.
Yes.
It's such a critical part of preserving American culture. So thank you so much for all the work that you do.
Thank you.
What's the website? I know we usually do this at the end. But
eagleforum.org. It's very easy.
Easy enough.
Yeah. And so many people would be interested in getting your work and knowing how they can get involved.
Absolutely. And if you go on eagleforum.org, we have a list of our state leaders with the state chapters and their websites as well. So if you want to get involved and you're in a state, you can contact us and we can put you in touch with them, or you can go directly to their website.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kris. We'll turn to you, Marty. This is your house, right? This is the house that Marty built. In many ways, I mean, we're living. I say this all the time. I mean, you've been on the Hill, and so we're living as a pro-life movement. The output of much of your work, working with Chris Smith, certainly. I mean, you got your start there. So And here at Cure, you guys have done so much for preserving life, for exposing the transgender ideology, for focusing on poverty and the real long-lasting solutions. So I'll give you just a chance to reintroduce Cure to folks, but also tell us of your priorities, the things you're looking to do in the next 3 months or so.
Well, because Cure was founded by Star Parker, and she has recently passed the baton to Donald Eason as the president, but Star is still on the board of Cure and is still engaged, and she still has a nationally syndicated column where she's speaking out on issues. And Cure's mission is really to address poverty in distressed communities and to bring the right kind of solutions to those distressed communities. We don't want to take what has failed in the distressed communities and spread it to all across America. We want to look at what has worked elsewhere, like free markets, personal responsibility, strong families, and we want to encourage that those things be more the norm in the distressed communities as well, and we bring those things to the distressed communities to provide equal opportunity there, to help bring jobs and hope and better education and better health care to those communities. So we've been speaking out now in this debate, started a commentary about Medicaid, where she said it's a poverty trap.
Yeah.
This idea that we can't touch Medicaid, it's not in the interest of people in distressed communities that we don't fix Medicaid. We need to have a better system for them. We need to have a system where patients are more in control. This government control of Medicaid, many doctors don't take Medicaid and so on. So it's problematic. So we need to help people there. We have a system, the payment system in Medicaid, when they did the expansion, they're now reimbursing states at 90% for able-bodied people without children, and on average somewhere at 60 to 67% for women and families with children, and poor people with children. The states are getting reimbursed at roughly 60 to 67% on average, but yet this 90%. We, among others, many people in the conservative healthcare community warned the states, if you go through this massive expansion of Medicaid, it's not sustainable.
Right.
And we've seen that this is a huge increase in federal spending on Medicaid, and that's got to be brought under control. So I think you have to limit the increases in Medicaid, and people say, well, that's a cut. No, if rather than having a 5% increase, if you only have a 3% increase,
That's right, yeah.
Or maybe another thing to look at is, why don't we think about block granting this to the states, saying, well, by the proportion of people that you have who need the help, then we'll provide it, and then give the states more skin in the game, like we did with welfare reform, that they are partners in reducing the wasteful spending. We see California and other states gaming the system.
Yep.
They come up with these schemes working with the hospitals on the reimbursement with the hospitals, where they're then able to get more funding from the federal government, and then they use that to pay for health care for illegal aliens who are not supposed to be covered under Medicaid.
I think
so there's a lot of, and that's billions and billions of dollars. In California alone, there was a scheme that was identified as more than $19 billion that was probably inappropriately paid by the federal government due to this scheme that California has come up with.
Well, I hope you folks got a good grasp of the wealth of knowledge that Marty has in terms of picking out the pieces, really pulling apart what is just seeming commonplace. So much of our money usage or our budget or our deficit is just because of routine. Us not willing to cut the fat, to make the hard cuts, to have the critical conversations that it takes to unravel what has been big government spending. We mentioned a lot, and so in the next segment, we'll really go into the details. What opportunities do we have through reconciliation to go after these big Medicaid pools? How do we make sure that the social issues are still front and center in determining our budget? All that we'll talk through in this next segment, so stick with us. We'll be right back here on Cure America.
Somebody comes to us when they are the most vulnerable. We have an obligation to our patients to tell the truth as we learned it and to not politicize it. We are performing surgeries on these children, and the only people benefiting is the medical industrial complex, because the more surgeries that are done, the more money is made.
Whether you're talking about an 8-year-old or an 11-year-old or a 14-year-old, I don't see how you can actually derive informed consent.
We all know that we can't be getting true informed consent.
Our medical industry has objectively been compromised in more ways than one. You become familiar with the sound a mother makes when you tell her that her child is dead.
Find out more at whatisadoctor.org.
Well, I hope you were tracking the first segment that we had where we're able to reintroduce to you once again some of these champion organizations that have been on the Hill, just making sure that good conservative policies are getting through, but also good Bible-based conservative social policies are still part of the fabric of America. There's certain resets that we have, not every year, but cyclically we have certain resets where we are able to redefine this is how we're spending our money, and we're in that season right now. We're in a budget reconciliation season where we can make value judgments and determine what we're going to fund, what levers we're going to turn down, and what dials we're going to turn up in terms of funding. And there's a lot of numbers being thrown around. The Senate is going to stay in over the weekend to sort of get their shot at the apple. The House has already passed sort of their instruction. There's a lot going on in terms of budget reconciliation, but what's sort of a through line that folks need to pay attention to? I know Marty's going to get into, sort of how CBO scores, but what's a through line that the average American can hold on to as they're discerning through the headlines of how they should be thinking about budget reconciliation?
Well, I think, frankly, and I think everyone would agree here at this table, Congress needs to go big and bold and now. Because I think one thing that we've seen, as you know, I have a long history in this town, and one thing that Congress is excellent at, kicking the can down the road, or saying we're going to do something big and then do something small, or we're going to do something big later in 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, and then it never really happens. They turn it off. A subsequent Congress turns it off. So I think what your viewers should really be looking at is put pressure on your member of Congress and on the White House and the administration. The cuts have to be big, bold, and right now. This year, next year, maybe the third year, not in the out years. And when you're dealing with the reconciliation process, your viewers probably know, which again is that fancy Washington word for getting something fast through the Senate, through Congress. And it's a special kind of spending, either tax reform or mandatory spending, the autopilot spending, the stuff that's on automatic pilot in the budget. You could do that in reconciliation. And frankly, the good news is that's where some of the biggest price tags are. In other words, if you have a family budget and you're buying 6 Ferraris every month, well, if you're going to cut your budget, you got to look at those Ferraris,
exactly right?
That's the thing. Reconciliation allows you to look at those Ferraris. You could get the Ferraris into the cutting, into the chopping block and get it going.
Well, that's so important, especially going big. There is this element of the Senate parliamentarian deciding which is just policy issues versus which are actual cuts that are being made. And so there's going to be that give and take with the Senate parliamentarian and certainly the senators that will be arguing in front of the parliamentarian for having some of these cuts be in place. But there is also, I guess, a deficit number attached to this. Kris, you talk to us quickly about looking down the road in this, going big or this opportunity to really reset the budget. Are we just kicking the can down the road? Is there going to be an increased deficit placed on our agenda and really wanting to push these through? Are we going to be incurring a debt that we're going to have to deal with later on? Or is this vehicle an opportunity for us to make those cuts across the board?
Well, this vehicle is the opportunity to make cuts. Whether or not Congress will actually do them is the big question, and whether the American people will go and really say, this has to be done now. As Paul said, we have kicked the can down the road to where we're looking at debts and deficits that are going to cripple our children. Our children's ability to buy houses, afford college, get jobs, all these things. It's easy for people who are 50, 60, 70 years old to say, I don't want to vote on that, I might not get reelected.
That's right,
But they're putting the burden on your children.
It's very important.
And so we have to make cuts now. And we also have to get our government back into, reflecting our values.
I think that's absolutely right.
So those two things, it's going to be hard because nobody really wants to make the cuts, and that's why we're in the position that we have. And everybody I want to start a new program to do this. I want to start a new program to that. I would say if we have programs that trap the American people in poverty, those are immoral programs, and we need to look at that. If we have programs that help people go from poverty to self-sufficiency, Those are great programs, and we need to replicate those. But right now, we have programs that do nothing but trap the poor in poverty, and we really need to look at them.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Much of, and Scripture says this, where your money is, that is where your heart is also. So you sort of reverse engineer that. What we've been spending our money on sort of dictates where we are as a country. You mentioned the huge expansion of Medicare and how much that is, Marty, how much that keeps people not just in poverty, but attracts more people into it, whether it's illegal migrants or very able-bodied individuals that know how to game the system. And that's where our value is. It is a socialist network. It's a socialist net that the government is propping up. And in that, to your point, Kris, they're able to pipe in all sorts of anti-biblical, anti-social conservative things, because that's the metric, that's sort of the skeleton that they put out there. It's a framework of, you're going to be relying on government, so you're going to take whatever government gives you. And so you'll have Medicaid paying for abortion, you'll have Medicaid paying for transgender surgeries, you'll have all these things that are against our conservative biblical beliefs, but they're in there because we've created a structure that allows it. Marty, how do we get rid of that structure, that routine that just continues to say, hey, government's going to subsidize so much of your life that we're going to rely on it for even some of these social issues? How do we break that apart? And is this reconciliation and going big, is this our chance to do so?
Well, I think so. One thing I think we should make is a distinction, be clear, because a lot of times they're get intertwined, or you say one, you think it's the other. It's Medicare and Medicaid are certainly two different programs. Medicare is primarily for the elderly and some disabled people, whereas Medicaid tends to be for low-income people, many below the poverty line, although we do allow people over certain percentages over the poverty line, and that's part of this whole expansion of Medicaid has kind of gone higher and higher and broader in terms of the people in there. So part of the problem, frankly, we have to be honest about, is one of the problems that you have these big programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, are big entitlement programs. One of the people who is the most important person who has taken those issues off the table is someone named Donald Trump. And so that makes it harder.
With certain certain senators that are in bluish purplish states are just saying, we don't really want to touch the Medicaid.
But they want to be very careful. Those are very tough programs to touch. More recently, he did say, well, we're not going to do Medicaid. And I think we do have to address Medicaid, but we don't have to accept the premise that when we reform these programs that we're cutting them. I think the same thing applies, frankly, to Social Security and Medicare, although I don't think we'll get to much in those areas. But with Medicaid, we can reform them. And again, if you have a situation where states are gaming the system and there's an incentive to just keep pushing people on there, more and more people, not the kind of people that it was originally intended for, but now a whole broader pool of people, and we don't have work requirements for able-bodied people and so on. When we did welfare reform, people said, people are going to die in the streets if you do this welfare reform. Well, it didn't turn out that way. It lifted up more people out of poverty. It helped people have the dignity of work. More people were working, and the dignity of working is really important to the whole social fabric of the country. So I think we should look at that.
That was under
Bill Clinton. Ultimately, it was Republican Congress, the Newt Gingrich speakership and so on. But it was Bill Clinton, even though he vetoed the first two welfare reform bills, he ultimately did agree to a major welfare reform bill. And so I think that's the model. I think we ought to be looking at really potentially block granting Medicaid, or at least getting the states more involved in more responsibility to help be partners to reduce the unnecessary spending. But it's in their interest too, is to game the system. That's the thing, is when you go and get as much money from Washington, that's a political accomplishment back home, right? And you are saying, well, we're sending all that money to Washington, we're just getting our money back again, and so on.
And you're hearing even in the cycle, earmarks making a return.
Earmarks is another part of that.
That's difficult. But Paul, how does the American voter consider all these things? The sort of the brass tacks, kitchen table conversations. They're looking at their ledger, and I like the analogy you made. If you're working on your household budget for a year and there's all this money being spent on luxuries, and you're saying, oh, how do we fix the essentials, the food, the electricity? Well, maybe you attack the luxuries first, and then that'll make it a bit easier. But how does the average American family, I would say, really consider what's going on? The debate that just seems so esoteric, so far away from our kitchen table, but applies to us every day. How do we look at that, especially in the season, considering some of these big cuts that that you're saying have to happen, some of these go big cuts.
It's a great point. And frankly, picking up on something Kris said, we have to look at these fiscal issues as moral issues as well, right? In other words, it's no, maybe that's our fault as conservatives, over the years, right? We've looked at fiscal issues as just, how do we balance the budget? How do the numbers work out? But you're right, it's affecting people personally. How? Because if you look at the federal budget, the number one expenditure, Medicare. Number two, Social Security. Number three, interest.
Okay, so just paying
Number
back.
three expenditure in the federal government is interest on past spending. So,
it's unbelievable.
That's maybe a way to bring it down to real people's kitchen table. Meaning, those taxes that you could hardly afford to pay, you're actually, chances are that's just going to pay for interest on past spending,
and now
interest on the debt.
It's become more than defense spending, right? Interest is now
Bigger
a larger part
spending,
than our
right?
defense spending.
Bigger than even things many Americans would agree, like, for example, fixing an interstate highway.
Right.
Many Americans would agree with that. No, your tax dollars aren't going to that because they first got to pay the interest on previous debt.
Yeah, that makes it very realistic. So you overcharge your credit card, and instead of even paying the principal balance, you're just paying on what you owe this entity for giving it to you. And that's obviously not sustainable considering what else we're not funding. Is there certain things you mentioned, sort of a tax restructuring? And I just want to pull back for 1 second.
Yeah.
In going big, so we've heard energy's on the table, borders on the table, taxes on the table. Are we doing too much? Are we not doing enough? Are there certain things that honestly are going to take priorities that we would probably wince and say, well, why don't we save this for another time just to make sure that these concrete changes that need to be made happen in the chance that we have them?
No, and it's a good question, right? Because you could see both sides, right? In one sense, oh my gosh, if you put everything in one big, beautiful bill, as the President has said, you can use that to if you will, get votes for the bill. In other words, if someone has, if a member of Congress has doubts about one part of the bill, well, he or she may like other parts of the bill. If you're putting it all together, everybody winds up voting for it. On the other hand, if you put everything in one big, beautiful bill, it may take longer, right, to assemble it, to write it, to actually make sure everyone's on board, get it through committee, House, Senate, changes, all of that kind of stuff. So, it could cut both ways.
Okay,
so we'll
and it all seems sort of like special interests. Like, hey, my piece is in there. I may not like the big package, but I'm going to vote for this because my particular piece is in there. And that may not reflect downstream to what the average American is looking for their representative to do. Just their, sort of slush pile or their piece of the pie getting funded or getting the attention that it needs there. Something that was sort of mentioned in taxes, and I think you can talk to this, is the child welfare tax or the certain taxes that do benefit the family. Are there pro-family approaches that we can have in this sort of fiscal climate, in this tax package that's coming through that make it easier on parents that are having children, or make it easier on couples that are married? What are we looking at in terms of certain pro-family tax?
I think one of the most important things that we see that the current tax rates have a very large per child deduction.
Okay.
And if the tax plan that President Trump put into place before go away, then the deduction per child will be halved. Like, you'll lose half of it.
That's like $3,000 per average family. That's a big chunk.
And kids are expensive.
Yeah.
And our tax code should reward married couples who have children and acknowledge the sacrifice and the costs that are involved. So we're very concerned about maintaining that per child tax deduction. And we also want to make sure that for those people who aren't married, that there's no penalty for getting married if you have children.
Right.
We want to encourage family formation because, number one, we know it's better for kids.
Yep.
And economically, it makes more sense for people to be married. Two can live a little bit cheaper together than they can separately.
Yep.
So those are two very big parts of the tax code that we're concerned about.
Yeah, I think that's so important. What you said that we all sort of laughed at is that kids are expensive, but at the same time, when you look at, they're contributing, right? You have a child that's able to contribute to the family business. You have a child that is gaining education. They're potential taxpayers as well. So it is an advantage for civilizations to have more children. Our tax codes
we need more children in this country. We do. So we don't want to discourage having kids, but we know that payoff for becoming a taxpayer doesn't happen for 16, 18
exactly
years.
Right. Yeah, looking down, or more, or looking down the highway. That's certainly something that we have to keep in mind when we're considering what's the long-term picture. Certainly, putting all that debt onto our children isn't the right approach.
Right.
We want to be able to incentivize folks having more arrows, more tools in their quiver, which are children that God has given us. We're going to dive into more of these topics, more of the headlines, certainly talk defund Planned Parenthood, tariffs. We're going to start with Marty on the other side of this break, so stick with us. We're going to continue sort of this rapid fire approach and get through the issues that matter to you and certainly matter to us here on Cure America.
My name is William Owens, America's poet. During the elections of 2016, I wrote a poem every day, and it's in my book, Poems for America. These poems speak to the issues of our nation like never before. Inspired by God, I know this book of poetry will be a blessing to you, your family, and your community. Visit my website, americaspoet.com.
Let's take a quick history lesson. Just 2 centuries ago, 94% of the people in the world lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's 8.5%. In a century, our life expectancies more than doubled. How did we come so far so fast? The freedom to create, to start a business, to keep what you earn. Don't let the socialists and radical left cost us our progress, our freedom, and our well-being. It's time we fight for America and vote for America.
Well, welcome back to Cure America. One of the big pieces of the pie that we really have to deal with is the amount of money that is going to Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood, once again, being responsible for something like 400,000 deaths of the unborn every year upon year, receiving $699 million in yearly allocations. It's your money going to them. We've had the opportunity, I think all of us were co-signers on a very large letter that went to Congress saying that it's the time now that we go after Planned Parenthood, that pool of money. Over 150 organizations from all 50 states, every corner of the country saying, let's get rid of this abortion juggernaut that is at a minimum costing taxpayer monies, but really their bottom line is aborting babies in the womb. Marty, I know this is an issue near and dear to your heart. In this past week, we saw the Supreme Court deal with individual states and their ability to defund Planned Parenthood. Talk us just a bit about, the case was Medina v. Planned Parenthood, but talk to us about the big picture. Medicaid fund coming from the federal government to hospitals or different clinics that do family planning. States are saying we don't want to use that to push abortion. How do you see that playing out, the ability of states to say no to that? And if the court resolves it in the right way, will these states continue to be able to discern this is how we're going to use the funds, even when it's coming from the federal government?
Yeah, we'd like to, if we can, keep money away from not just Planned Parenthood, but other abortion providers as well. Planned Parenthood goes through this kind of shell game and explaining how their money is spent, and they claim it's being spent on all these other things, but so much of it is all tied to abortion. They're really not trying to encourage to any great degree people to choose something other than abortion. So many of the services that they're getting reimbursed for are kind of ancillary to the ultimate decision to have the abortion. So I think that that's something we'll have to look at very closely. But I hope this stays in the budget reconciliation process, because this is a very important thing. There is a lot of debate about whether that will be in there, but I think that certainly people who care about life, who care about the family, want to make sure that that's not part of what's in our final budget bill that is passed by Congress. Yeah, to your point, on the ground, and perhaps we'll have B-roll of this, but on the ground yesterday you saw, the two sides in front of the court, or last week you saw two sides in front of the court really agitating the court about their perspective on defunding Planned Parenthood. The pro-aborts, if you look at their interviews, they were saying, hey, Planned Parenthood does all these other things like, cancer screening and breast cancer screening and,
curriculum and all this other stuff. We have to keep Planned Parenthood because they're doing so much good to their community. But even when it comes to their child training mechanism, I think it's like 0.001% of the budget actually talks to parents about how to care for a child. So it's nothing to do with family planning. It has to do with their bottom line, which is abortion. Not to be missed. This is a shot that we have out of Energy and Commerce to line item Planned Parenthood and other abortion providers and say that we don't want this huge pool of money going to them. But it's not a done deal, right? We still have several layers of getting the parliamentarian, getting a good CBO score, and getting members, squishy Republicans, to really hold on to this piece in saying that we want to get rid of Planned Parenthood. Kris, what are you sort of hearing from your constituents? Is this a priority? And also, how do we get that to
It is
Congress?
a priority, and not only does Planned Parenthood make most of their money off abortions and the abortion pill and transgender drugs, the puberty blockers, the cross-sex hormones, it's all tied into that. But for those people out there who say, well, but they provide cancer screenings and they provide other things. There are other local health clinics that are funded by the federal government that do that. And every time we try to move money away from the abortion mill and the transgender medicine mill and into these other things, people say, no, I don't want to do that. I want this organization that exists to kill babies and raise money to give to politicians who want to kill babies.
Exactly right.
It is a loop. We give them money, they use it to raise money to give back to politicians who want to kill babies.
Exactly right.
And so this is the time, this is our one shot. And I think the White House needs to hear, Congress needs to hear that this is a non-negotiable. People of faith, people who care about unborn life and care about children, need to make this the priority in this bill.
I think you're absolutely right. It's not something that we budge from. But there is pushback, right? Even in Republican districts, even in Republican members, it's not the easiest talking point, and so folks are sort of wincing back. You saw the White House in this past week as well through its Title X funding remove about $20 million that goes to Planned Parenthood, just a drop in the bucket.
But a good step.
I think a good step in the right direction. But how do we sort of gauge big picture if we're all walking in the right direction, including the White House? If they will be singing from the same hymnal and really a full court press against Planned Parenthood, or are we just going to continue the sort of the picking and choosing? We'll defund them of this certain amount, they'll still be in existence, or we'll defund them of a small portion of what we ultimately give them, and sort of give conservatives a pat on the head saying, hey, you got your piece of the pie. How do we make sure that we don't end up there and really hold the White House, hold certain Republicans accountable to what the entire base, I think, really wants?
Well, frankly, you just used the right word, accountable, right? Accountability, right? All of us and all the pro-life movement and the grassroots activists have to constantly make it heard in the administration and on the Hill, and frankly, state legislators too. This is a priority. This has to happen now. Again, going back to a previous segment,
exactly right.
This isn't something next year. This isn't 5 years. This isn't delay. This has to happen right now. And I would argue we have to, if you will, fire all bullets at all targets. In other words, because there are pots of money that we can get at through reconciliation, but you can't get at everything through reconciliation. So let's get it through other ways, either through, for example, Russ Vought at the Office of Management and Budget, great pro-life leader. He's talked about getting at certain buckets through regulatory approaches. There's things you can do through the appropriations process, the regular spending, the annual discretionary appropriations process. You can get at it through that. Let's just keep going, keep going, keep going. But you're right. There should be some concern in the base, right, in the pro-life base, because you've got pro-lifers in the administration, you've got pro-choicers in the administration, including high-profile ones like our HHS secretary. So we've got to watch out.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point. It's not a done deal. We repeat it often on the show because it does require the base to continue. It requires groups to continue talking about. And not as if this is, the big golden calf that, once Planned Parenthood stops receiving federal funding that the fight is over. But this is one shot. It's a critical way of saying for American culture, for our domestic policy, we're not going to prop up an organization that makes its bottom line by aborting babies. Not only that, the transgender health, so-called health is,
the body parts trafficking.
Body parts trafficking.
Which they've basically admitted to, which is unbelievable.
The racist eugenic past that they've admitted to, saying that, this is where our founder was, and they haven't shied away from that. So there's so many reasons why American tradition and values shouldn't be propping up a juggernaut like this domestically, but also internationally. something like well over $100 million of what they receive from Americans go overseas to do abortions in countries that don't want abortions, where it's illegal to do abortions. They go in and they brag about reversing laws in certain states, even in the Mexican states, reversing laws, bringing in different African or Latin American cultures that reject abortion and saying, well, we're using our political arm to change some of those laws to allow abortion. So there's so many reasons to go after Planned Parenthood.
It's threat, it's blackmail. I mean, that's what right. International Planned Parenthood is doing with the blessings of the previous administration, who said, if you want this money, you have to change your laws. Yep. You have to allow abortion. You have to allow gender transition. You have to allow all these things. That's not exporting American values. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That is bribing other countries to go against the will of their own voters. And it needs to stop. And I think this administration, if they will be bold and stand on this, they will find that the American people are behind them on this.
It's a new form of colonialism. It's saying, hey, we're going to come to your country, rewrite your culture, but we'll give you certain things that'll help you all out, and Americans need to know that. Talk a bit about the play that we're seeing, or sort of the conversations that we're seeing from other countries or other like-minded entities. I'm thinking Hungary. I'm thinking certain countries that are now coming back to U.S. leadership and recognizing that we can take bold stands for our culture. Marty, could you just speak a bit to that point of other coalitions amongst countries, even if it comes to trade or comes to how our economy works? Are other countries sort of getting on board with this new American vision that we're going to do the right thing socially, that's going to impact our fiscal policy? Are we seeing that reverberate around the world?
Well, one of the things that President Trump did in the first few days of his administration was to restore the U.S. role in what's called the Geneva Consensus Declaration. And that is an agreement that we will respect the sovereignty of other countries when it comes to these kind of values issues, that we should not be pressuring foreign countries to have pro-abortion laws, to break down parental rights and things of that, and religious liberty and things of that nature. So there was an organization, a friend of ours in this community, who founded an organization, the Institute for Women's Health, who was keeping that whole thing alive during the Biden administration. And they actually grew the number of countries from, I believe, 30 to 34 who signed on to it. But we now, if we would perhaps bring in someone like that to be the leader and be the person who could help work with those countries, if the U.S. would not just say we're rejoining it, but take a real leadership role, and that we could strengthen those countries so that they could stand up to the international Planned Parenthoods and some of the other organizations that are out there, World Bank type of organizations that may be putting pressure on them to change their laws with respect to life and other cultural areas. That would be a really important thing. So I think to see the U.S. being more visible and taking a leading role, encouraging more countries to become part of this Geneva Consensus Declaration, I think that would be an important thing for the administration to do.
I think that's so important. And if you're seeing a theme in our conversation agreement, it's not because we bring all the same approach to these issues, but there are common threads that are so consistent around our values, the chief of them being life. How do we preserve life? And seeing all the different facets that we can continue to engage with Congress and the White House just to ensure that principle of life is valued. So many different approaches, domestically, internationally, challenging even the respected powers that we've elected, just to ensure that principle doesn't change and it's part of American culture going forward. We're going to come out of this segment. When we come back, we'll sort of do another round robin and hit some more of the headlines. We'll talk tariffs. We'll talk some of these things that you've seen in the news recently, and just give an overall perspective of how we should be interpreting the noise of the news here. We'll do that right on the other side of this break here on Cure America.
God birthed in my heart years ago to do this work of CURE, the Center for Urban Renewal and Education.
We are incredibly privileged to have pastors from across the nation here for training and collaboration on solutions to help our communities.
Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It must be fought for.
The Declaration meant what it said. All men are created equal.
We're to awaken, train, and mobilize the church as a whole, but the historically black church in particular, to end abortion in our communities.
Every church needs to do everything it can to help be an educational hub.
The crisis of the day is the sexual gone wrong, and it's going extraordinarily wrong. Us Christians are called to correct that by living the sexuality that God has given us.
It was the church who created the idea of educating every boy and girl. The idea of public health care, guess where that came from? The church. And it was actually the church who was commissioned to do the work of charity. Guess who's actually robbed you of part of what it is that you're to do? It's government, and they failed miserably at it. They're not called to do it.
Government is not God.
Are we going to bow to government, or are we going to bow to God?
The kids need to see that confidence that we have about the truth. We're not in doubt about who we are.
Welcome back to Cure America. I hope you've been tuning in to the robust discussion about some critical parts of American culture, some critical parts of our budget that we really have to deal with, and the urgency of dealing with really a mandate, what the elected officials in Congress and at the White House were put in place to do. But we also don't want to get ahead of our skis. So there's so much in Congress that's moving so fast, and it's good that we're getting a lot of wins, but you don't want to put anything in place that down the road will regret. And we sort of mentioned at the top of the hour, Harry Reid and nuking sort of the filibuster rule when it came to judges allowing Republican wins, and something that Democrats certainly regret, having a conservative court, but they really sort of teed that up for us. So not taking a page from them, but learning the lessons of their failure. How do we avoid sort of making the same mistakes that we're running with an agenda, we're running with a mandate, but not putting things forward that are long-term against conservative principles? Paul, I'll sort of come to you on that big picture question. Been in the city a long time. How do we avoid the pitfalls of getting good wins, but still maintaining the conservative structure of government, the separation of powers?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I'm a guy that keeps in my jacket pocket every day that I can a copy of the Constitution.
Yeah, so important.
To actually not only look at it, but it's sometimes a physical reminder of like, okay, this is what we're here for. Yeah. This is what everything should be judged against, guided against, guided by, that kind of thing. And so there's unfortunately too many folks who are maybe guided more by how does it feel today, or how can I help a certain politician that I like, as opposed to what's right, what's the American principle, what's the constitutional principle, and to go with there. And yeah, sometimes that is going to hurt, because you may say, oh, sticking in the Constitution means it may hurt my guy a little bit in this moment, my member of Congress, or my
with this particular agenda
yeah. But in the long run, I think that will help our nation, and ultimately, I would argue, helps our guys in the long run on the right if we stick to the Constitution. It's the left that's going willy-nilly and has no guideposts, and you wind up getting these crazy policies we've been talking about today. So.
I think you're absolutely right. To put a fine point on that, so there was a bill that was on the floor last week, was ultimately pulled, that talked about proxy voting. Can you work us through what proxy voting means?
Yes. Proxy voting is something that allows members of Congress to designate another member to vote in their place if they're not going to be in Washington. Okay. Now, think about our nation's 250 years. We never had proxy voting.
It's important.
Before we had cars, before we had trains, before we had airplanes, members were supposed to go to Washington and vote in person. Why? Because sitting around talking with your friends, you refine ideas that way.
Well, they do the work of the people, right?
They do the work of the people. Yeah. And if a member is there, chances are your member is going to be doing the work of the people and not an unelected staffer doing the work of the people, which is the dirty little secret behind how a lot of this town works. But there was a congresswoman on the Democrat side who joined with one on the Republican side. They were both new moms. And they said, we want to be able to proxy vote for 3 months following the birth of our children. So we want to be able to be at home and tell somebody else how we want to vote. That person will vote for me. But when they wrote it, they just didn't say it was for them and people who have had babies. But if a male member of Congress, their spouse has a baby, they also get 3 months off. Now, that sounds compassionate.
Yeah, help us work through that, because our folks can be like, hey, that just sounds like time off work. Yeah.
We're pro-baby. But where does it end?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Does it, if you're a member and your wife has cancer, or you have cancer, or God forbid you get shot like Steve Scalise, do you get to vote proxy? No. Yeah. You're allowed to miss votes. And it's okay to miss votes. And there are members of Congress who have had babies and they've missed some votes because they had a baby. And you know what? Their constituents say, well, that's a legitimate reason to miss a vote. We'll reelect you.
But put something in statute that says,
Constitution, right, the Constitution says you have to be in person to count for how many members you're going to have there for vote. You actually have to be in person. So we think they have to be in person.
Yeah, I think that's a strong
And in COVID, we allowed proxy voting. People were voting from boats, from fundraisers, from European trips. It wasn't just that they were afraid of getting sick in Washington. They used it to go out and do all kinds of things. You need to be here in Washington. You need to vote. Sean Duffy was a member of Congress from Wisconsin. His wife had their ninth baby. She had a hole in her heart. She had Down syndrome. He said, I'm going to resign from Congress because I need to be home. And his daughter just put something on Twitter that said, my dad made a decision like every other family makes a decision. And that's what we're asking for here. Not special privileges, but Washington is too important to not have our members of Congress here.
Yeah, no one's forcing them to take these jobs.
Right. And guess what? They have child care in the House of Representatives. And you can actually leave your baby in the office, run down and vote. You can have a nanny there. You can have your spouse there. There are things you can do. But to say you get 3 months to sit at home and to say, no offense, guys, but that when your wife has a baby, you get 3 months off.
You can't show up to work. No, that's absolutely right. Yeah,
you're right.
You couldn't. I mean, you couldn't. Certain critical industries, you're required to be there.
Exactly.
And folks are given vacation time. Congress is given plenty of time off.
They work an average of 150 days a year in Washington.
So in August, they are on their boats, right?
Yes,
They're not required to be in town.
They work no more than 3 or 4 days a week here. It's not like they're here, 40, 50, 60 hours every single week, day in, week in, and week out.
And the second thing, they don't have an ownership, is to your point, like you're not required to run for Congress. And, we want the right people in there and we champion the right people in there, but they don't have an ownership of that seat such that they can play with the levers and benefit them in a way that does impact the work of the people. If you're not here in the seat, you're not actually pouring over bills, and even if you are, your presence there just for quorum, basically, or for challenging or making a statement on the floor that reintroduces into the narrative your perspective or your constituents' perspective. That's why folks are sent to Congress. So I think it's strong. I love the balance that certainly you and your constituents are coming from the perspective of helping mothers that are engaging in the workplace. But you can put a fine point on that. You can say that there's certain expectations of a member of Congress, of a president, that requires you to be there. So I like the way you really explain that.
There can be a balance. And new moms, if they needed time off and they miss votes, that's okay. I remember in the 90s when the first female elected official had a baby while in office. And there was a big deal, and that was great. And she was able to balance it. And she missed some votes, and her constituents said, that's a legitimate reason. That's an excused absence.
But placing it in the law where folks can take it. And to your point about COVID as well, there were members coming in with like 60, names, 60 names saying all these names vote yay. That's not how our system works. Marty, I'll come to you just on the point of long-term things that we're voting on or considering that may not have the best conservative outcome. So, of course, every time Trump has put out an executive order, if not all of them, the majority of them gets an immediate challenge in court. So you'll have, the ACLU or a number of interest groups, Freedom from Religion, that have legal teams. They'll instinctively go to courts. They forum shop in terms of finding the right judge in the right district that they know will have a nationwide injunction, basically stopping the president's ability to put this forward. And so in reaction to that, we're coming up with a number of proposals, and you can work us through them, that sort of say, hey, a judge, you can't have that much power over our particular president's agenda. And that's really, in the season that it's in, without hiding it, that's really what it's about. We don't want the judicial branch checking the executive in this fashion, but there may be some synergy there or some good that can come out of that. So can you work us through when it comes to nationwide injunctions, when it comes to judges pushing back against the president, can you walk us through sort of what the ideal would be, or some of the proposals that we've seen come through Congress? How do we sort of work through that?
Well, the irony is that one of those bills was scheduled to be voted on the very next day, and actually the rule they were voting on in Congress when it went down over this dispute about proxy voting was a rule to limit the jurisdiction of these judges, and that was part of the rule. And also the SAVE Act, to the election integrity bill, that was going to be the very next day on Thursday. So this was a Tuesday evening vote, I believe, on the rule. They were going to vote on Wednesday on the limiting the judges, the rogue rulings of the judges, and on Thursday they were going to vote on the SAVE Act, and those were all shut down until the following week if they can resolve this dispute. So, yeah, I think this is something that conservatives have used at times, is when we saw some liberal judges doing some things, or we had conservatives who were going after some of the bad policies coming out of the Biden administration, we got injunctions. So I think there probably has to be some balance in how we do that, but certainly there is a problem with forum shopping. We should have some more uniform system. And this bill that was being considered also provided a mechanism. You could have some nationwide injunctions under certain circumstances, but you would have to allow a special 3-judge panel to quickly decide those cases. And also that if you weren't in agreement with the decision that came out of that 3-judge panel, you would have an opportunity for an expedited review to the Supreme Court. So that's one of the things I would like to see with a lot of these disputes. Let's just get the Supreme Court, get this case to them, resolve it, and then let's move on. President Trump may win some of those, he may lose a few others, but I think we have to get resolution on this so we can move forward and get these things, because there's a lot of important legislation, a lot of important policy that needs to be decided, and we can't be bogged down in all these disputes.
Yeah, and these legal disputes, and certainly we can't have such a trust in the executive branch. I'm not naming any president, but such a trust in the executive branch that we're allowing them through executive orders to really tilt the balance in whatever favor they want without there being a pushback, a sort of check and balance. Paul, we're down to a minute, so I'll sort of give you the final word. Through line, traditional conservatives, hopeful, optimistic, challenging. What would you say to the conservative member or voter that has looked at their country in the past few months, the direction we're going in? What do you say to them as sort of a takeaway for this next week?
First, a very shameless plug, advancingamericanfreedom.com is our website.
Thank you for putting that up.
Go to that. Shameless. We're hopeful. We really are. And it kind of starts from the top. Vice President Mike Pence, again, is our founder, is very active in the organization. He's optimistic because when he and we travel around the country, we just see thousands and thousands of Americans who are traditional conservatives. Again, traditional moral values, strong American leadership on the world stage, free markets, free trade with free nations, things along those lines. So we know that the base is there, that the core constitutional base is there, and we know that we can go forward with that.
Excellent. Paul used the word hopeful. We're not the ones without hope, is what St. Paul ultimately said. We have a hope. We have a future. We have the ultimate perspective that God sits on the throne. He raises kings and sets them down. He's the one that ultimately ordains and orders the balance of nations. And we do have trust in his word. We have trust in his promises to us. And we do have fighters. We have conservative fighters that are here every day on the Hill, making sure that those values, your traditional perspectives, are being represented. We're not going to lose sight of the end game. We're not going to lose sight of holding our members accountable, because ultimately we want to direct this entire nation back towards that biblical basis of honoring God, of respecting religious liberty, of preserving life, and ensuring that families have a strong central place in all of our policies. So thanks for joining us this week. Stick with us on this station. We'll be back next week with more discussion in ways that we can continue to transform America for good. Stick with us at Cure America.